All right, good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, depending on which side of the ocean you're on today. My name is Danielle, and I'll be your trainer for today's webinar. Today, we're going to be talking about MAXQDA's visual tools. So we'll be taking a really in-depth look at all of the tools that are on the Visual Tools tab, and we'll talk about how they work and how you can apply them to your own data. Before we begin, just a few quick notes about online webinar hygiene. I'm sure we're all really used to it by now, but just a reminder to keep your microphone on mute for the duration of the webinar. That way we won't get any background noises. And if you have any questions throughout the demonstration today, please feel free to put those in the chat. If it's something that I can answer in the moment, I will go ahead and do so. Or if it's a question that is more related to another tool, or I'm going to get there later, I might wait until the end to answer your question. But please don't feel like I'm ignoring you. I'm just going to get to your question at the end. Also, before we begin, I would just like to introduce myself a little bit more. As I mentioned, my name is Danielle, and I'm currently based in Chicago. I got my master's degree at the University of Chicago a few years ago now, and while I was there, I studied social science. In particular, I was a sociologist working with a lot of ethnographic data that I collected in Senegal. So I've been a MAXQDA user since about 2017, so just going on 4 years now, and I've been a trainer for 3 of those years. Today, I'm working in qualitative healthcare market research, so I do a lot of interviews and focus groups with doctors, patients, anybody in the healthcare field, and I get to talk to them about different drugs or different diseases, and I get to analyze that data and make recommendations. So I do get to use MAXQDA quite a lot for that work, which is pretty awesome. So yeah, I'm frequently in MAXQDA almost every day. On top of that, I am a MAXQDA trainer and consultant, so I do one-on-one or group trainings, and I also do co-analysis. So if you have any specific questions about your work, like, how can I really make MAXQDA work for my specific research question or my specific methodology, that's something that I would be happy to meet with you about. You can feel free to email me. My email is there on the screen. It's danielle@jacques.com. I'm also on Twitter. So yeah, any questions, big or small, please feel free to reach out and we can see, what we can do to help you out in your MAXQDA journey. So before I switch to MAXQDA, I wanted to just give a really brief overview of what the visual tools actually are and how they can help you analyze your coded data. So the visual tools that we're going to be looking at today are, of course, on the Visual Tools tab in the blue toolbar at the top of MAXQDA. And today we're going to be talking about actually everything from Code Matrix Browser, the second one here, to Word Cloud. We won't be touching on Max Maps today, only because Max Maps is probably another 2-hour webinar in itself, and I didn't want to give a really crash course in it. So we'll just be going really in depth into all these others here today. And with these tools, what we can do is we can create maps that visualize connections or relationships across our project. So we could build off of pre-made models or start from scratch. We can also visualize the frequency of codes in our documents or in document groups. And through that, we can really visualize the co-occurrence of codes. So we can see where codes are overlapping, or which documents are using which codes more frequently than others. We can also plot our documents and our codes on maps according to their similarity. So we can compare how similar these codes are or how similar these documents are and actually visualize that spatially. And in addition, we can compare cases and really create typologies of our documents that we have. We can also look at, with the document portrait and Codeline, we can see where codes fall within documents, and then we can compare how those codes are really used across multiple documents, or we can follow a code throughout the length of a document to really understand the context, like what's happening around this code. Are there other subjects that we're talking about at the same time? Kind of what's going on there. And lastly, a classic, we can use a word cloud to create a visualization of the most frequently used words in a document or documents. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and switch to MAXQDA. And just a note that today is an advanced webinar. So if you're newer to MAXQDA, I do still encourage you to please stay. I think you'll get a lot out of this workshop, but just know that some of the more basic functions of MAXQDA, like creating and applying codes to the data, I won't necessarily be touching on that today. It's going to be really more focused on those visual tools, but again, please feel free to or feel comfortable to stay. I think there's something in this for everyone. And before I open up the project as well, I always, regardless of your level of MAXQDA, want to draw your attention to these resources that are on the right-hand side of this screen. These are all free learning materials for MAXQDA. There's the Getting Started guide here with the rocket. This is a short PDF that tells you everything you need to know to get started with MAXQDA. And then there's also the online manual, which has every single function of the software written out in step-by-step instructions on how to use it. And it also talks about some of the underlying mechanisms behind the tools as well. So if you're ever stuck at any point, I always recommend either check out the Getting Started guide or the online manual, and you'll find lots of help in those. Additionally, there's the videos over here on the side. These are free YouTube videos that you can watch. They're about 3 to 5 minutes long. And then also, finally, there is the research blog, where researchers like yourselves have written examples of how they've used MAXQDA to analyze their research. So there's lots of different examples of various methodologies in here. Different types of research, whether it's like qualitative, mixed methods, quantitative even. So if you're looking for inspiration or you have a specific methodology and you're like, how can I use MAXQDA to help me actually facilitate this, you can probably find an example on the research blog. And the research blog does have multiple languages in it, so highly recommend checking it out. That said, today I'm going to open up a project of mine. It's actually a version of the data that I collected for my master's thesis. So this isn't the finished file. This is sort of about halfway through the process. But what we essentially have here is I have about, I think there's 11 or 12 documents here, and these are semi-structured interviews that I conducted. You'll see here my data is in French, so I apologize if you don't speak French, but I don't think that the fact that it's in French will hinder any of the visual tools today. And then lastly, over here in the code system, I have a bunch of codes. They're all on the same level. They haven't really been organized yet. So you'll see they're all just blue. There's no really subcodes. But I do have this category here called bus journey / experience. And within this category, I have grouped by color various elements of the bus journey. So these interviews are, as I said, semi-structured, and they're talking to people in Dakar, Senegal about a particular type of bus system that operates throughout the city. And so I have things like how you actually use the bus, like waiting for the bus, where are the stops, what are the routes, I have here in yellow the different actors who are involved in the bus. So we have like the driver, we have the person who collects the fare, we have the actual passengers. We also have things like how the bus is actually set up and how it's a cultural artifact. And lastly, in red, I have different elements of safety on the bus. This was a hot topic for my interlocutors who talked at length about safety, theft, overcrowding, etc., all the problems that they faced while riding the bus. So before I jump into any of the visual, I'm sorry, I'm going to back up 1 second. The coding strategy that I used on these documents is I used the highlight codes that you see here, so this blue highlight in the document, to do a round of descriptive coding. And so even though my interviews and my research were focused on just one particular type of bus, it was often impossible for my respondents to talk about this bus without also talking about other types of buses in the city. And so I essentially assigned a highlighter to each type of bus. So we have here in the code system, we have green for the Dumb Dick bus, blue for the Car Rapide, purple for the Tata, and yellow for taxi, and so on. And so anytime we're talking about, bus A, I would highlight that in blue. The Dumb Dick is the subject of this conversation here, so this is in green, and so on. So there was just a round of descriptive coding like that. And then on top of those highlight codes, I did a round, or several rounds really, of thematic coding. So you'll see I have in almost every single paragraph here highlight codes with more thematic codes superimposed on top. Now, before we talk about the visual tools in this tab up here, I do want to just give an overview of activation. Activation in MAXQDA is a truly fundamental function of the software, because without properly understanding activation, you won't really be able to work the visual tools or really any of like the mixed methods tools or some of the analysis tools properly. And depending on what you have activated, the results of the visual tools will be drastically different. So if you're unfamiliar, activation in MAXQDA is how you tell the software which documents and which codes you're interested in analyzing, or which codes and documents you're wanting to look at. So for all of these visual tools here, you can run them, but MAXQDA won't actually know what you want to look at unless you've activated those documents and activated those codes. The good thing is activation is extremely easy in MAXQDA. You'll notice that to the left of all of these documents here in the document system, there's this little gray dot. And if you click on that dot, the document will turn red, which means that it's activated. So now I have Adama's interview activated, which means that for a lot of these visual tools and for a lot of the mixed methods and so on, MAXQDA now knows that I'm interested in looking at Adama. But none of the other interviews are activated, so it knows at the same time that we're not interested in Ado, we're not interested in Bas, we're not interested in Cisse, etc. I can activate more than one document at a time just by continuing to click the gray dot next to it. Or I can activate everything all at once by clicking the gray dot at the top level here. So if I click it next to the documents folder, you'll see it's now activated all of my interviews within my document system. The same thing is true for the code system. If I were to click on the gray dot next to lack of education here, it turns red. So this code is now activated. So now, same thing with the documents, MAXQDA knows that we're looking at lack of education, but we're not looking at any of the other codes here in the code system. I can activate codes one by one, again by clicking, or I can activate all of the codes either in the code system or all of the subcodes of a particular code by clicking on the top level. So if I click on bus journey/experience here, you'll see all of the subcodes underneath are now activated. You can reset your activations at any time by clicking on the reset button in the code system or in the document system. So up here in the top toolbar of the code system, there's this option here, reset activation. If I click this, all of those activations are now turned off. It works the same way in the document system, where if you have things activated, you click on this first button in the toolbar, and it will turn everything off. You can also turn on or off activation manually just by clicking and clicking it again. So if it's activated, click the little arrow there, and now it's back to gray. So with the understanding of activation under our belts, I'm going to go ahead and we're going to talk about, as I said at the very beginning, all of the visual tools here from Code Matrix to Word Cloud. We're actually going to make our way backwards, so we'll start with Word Cloud and we'll end today with the Code Matrix browser. The word cloud from here is based on documents. So it will make a word cloud based on the document that you pull into the screen here. This is just a simple drag and drop. So you can pull your documents from the list in the document system and physically drag and drop them into this middle box here. There's also the option up here in the top right corner of the screen, or of the box rather, to insert activated documents. So if I activate some documents, you'll see now this option is available and I can insert them all quickly just by clicking that button. So you have to make a decision here, like what do you actually want the word cloud to be based off of? Do you want it to be based off of several interviews or several documents? Or do you want it to be just off of one or two or any mix in between? You can always clear the list by clicking on that button up here at the top left, and you can start over with any document you choose. When you're all set, you can hit OK, and it will generate a word cloud based on whatever you put into that box. And chances are the first time you do a word cloud, it's going to look like this. It's going to be not helpful at all because it's going to have all of these filler words in it. You'll have things like I, my, he, she, the, a, and all those filler words are those unimportant words that really don't matter for a word cloud. And so what we're going to do first is come up here in the top left to word frequencies. This is going to list out all of our words in the order of descending frequency. So we have our most frequent word here, and then it continues to go down. We can ban a word from the word cloud or add it to the stop list by double-clicking the green diamond that's to the left of it. And we can do that manually, making our way down the list. Or we can select multiple words at the same time by holding down the Shift key, holding down the Shift key on our keyboard and selecting multiple at the same time. From here, we can ban them all by clicking the Add to Stop List button up here at the top. So I'm gonna just continue to ban some words here. You can also import a stop list as well into MAXQDA. So if you already have a stop list that's in Excel format, or you've downloaded one from around the web, you can import that to MAXQDA, and it will already, it'll go ahead and ban all those words for you, so you won't have to do it manually like I am here. Okay, we'll leave it at that. Once you're happy with the words that you've banned or added to your stop list, you can simply X out of the word cloud as well. And I'm actually going to restart it, so come back in, and it will apply that stop list. So now you can see already we have a lot more meaningful words here in our word cloud. We have things like vehicles, we have aggression, we have hour, population, etc. We can change the formats and the rules for including words in the word cloud up at the top of the screen here. So we have first a option to change the number of words that are appearing in the word cloud. We can set it to, we can set it to fewer than 50 words just by dragging this little slider here, and it will take words away. Or you can also increase it so you can have up to 150 of the most common words in your word cloud. You can also set a minimum frequency. So you can say, okay, I want 50 words, but they have to appear in the transcripts at least 5 times. Or maybe you say, I want it at least 3 times. You can set that minimum there. You can also come up to the Format tab up in the blue strip here. And this will give you lots of options to change the way that it looks. So you can change the shape of your word cloud to a circle, square, triangle. You can change the alignment of the words. So we can put them at an angle. We can keep them all horizontal. You can also change the colors of the words. There's lots of different schemes here. And there's also lots of options for changing the font, the distance that the words are from one another, and also the size of the smallest word. There's also an option to change the scale. So you can say, okay, I want the most frequently used words larger, or you can also make your most frequently used words smaller. And you can change where that largest word appears in the word cloud. So instead of having it in the center, you could have it on the outside edge, or even have it randomly placed within the word cloud. There's always the rearrange button here as well, which will randomly rearrange the words based on the criteria that you've set up here at the top. When you're happy with your word cloud, if you would like to share it in an article or a presentation, you can hit this camera icon here. This is the copy to clipboard option, and you can then go ahead and paste it into another program. You could also use the export option here with the arrow, and this will allow you to save it to your computer as a image file, and then you can keep it for later and use it however you would like. You can also access word clouds through the retrieved segments window, which is the 4th main window in MAXQDA. Retrieved segments will retrieve coded segments of text based on specific documents and specific codes. So if you don't want to do a word cloud on the document as a whole, you could do it based on codes. So here in the Retrieve Segments window, it works again on activation. You can decide which documents you would like to activate. We'll do everything. And then you can also activate your codes. So let's say I wanted to create a word cloud based on this code that I have here, which is in discipline, across all of my documents. I activated all of my documents. I activated the code I'm interested in, And now here in retrieved segments, I have only the segments of text that have been coded with this blue code. So now I can come up to the top toolbar of my retrieved segments, and I can actually create a word cloud just based on these results here. So when I create this word cloud, it will ignore any of the words in those transcripts that do not appear in this window. Now you can see, of course, it's quite different than the one we just had. The one we just had, the largest word was the word for state, and now it's the word for indiscipline. Next, we have Codeline. And what the Codeline will do is it shows the location of codes within a document visually. So let me just reset everything here. We'll use veto as an example. And I'm going to just activate all of my codes within the bus journey category here. When I click on Codeline, I have the option to only include the activated codes. And so if I check this off, what it's going to do is it's only going to show me the visual results for these activated codes here, but it's going to ignore anything that's not activated. So all of these other codes that are here in black will be excluded from the code line that we'll see. Aggregate on first level will aggregate all of the results on the top level code. And so in this case, I don't want to do that because what it will do is it will take all of these, 20 or 30 codes here and aggregate all the results up into bus journey and experience. But of course, these codes that I have here have different meanings attached to them. They're quite different actually. And so I don't want to aggregate because I'll lose that meaning. You can also choose to do a weight filter if you've used weight in your coding. When you're happy with these settings, you hit OK. And the result here is this grid where on the left-hand side you have all of the codes that you chose. And then you have as your columns actually paragraphs in your transcript. So this here, paragraph 1 through 3, refers to the first 3 paragraphs in the transcript. And you can actually visit those paragraphs in the document browser. So here we have Vito's interview, and this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, etc. You can see the numbers over here on the left-hand side. So what this is showing me is the location of these various codes within the paragraphs. So as I scroll to the right, I'm getting further and further in the transcript, and I can see where Vito has talked about these various codes. The color that appears is the color of the code. And in this case, you don't need to be intentional about your colors in order to interpret these results, right? All of these codes could be in red, and I would still be able to interpret the results because I have the name of the code over here on the left-hand side. So I can easily see that this is routes in the accessible neighborhoods of the bus in purple, and this purple here is cost of trip. I mentioned color here because color is actually a really important analytical tool in MAXQDA, and we'll see in just a second that if you're not intentional about your colors when you code, some of the visual tools simply won't be interpretable for you. The length of the bars here refers to the having the code in continuous adjacent paragraphs. And so here, this one is very small because it's probably only in paragraph 1. And then we have, for instance, this one in paragraphs 10 through 11. It's much longer, so it's within a larger segment of paragraphs 10 through 11. So what can we do with this screen here? The first thing that we can do is we can follow a code to see where it appears and what appears next to it. So for example, we have here overcrowding on this line. This was talking about how the buses are often overcrowded, completely filled to the brim with people. So I can follow this throughout the interview and see what other topics are coming up alongside of or near overcrowding. I can see here in paragraph 6 through 7, he's talking about overcrowding. And then in paragraph 8 through 9, he's talking about safety. And so that gives me some idea that these two concepts are perhaps closely linked, at least enough so that he would talk about safety while he's talking about overcrowding of the bus. We can also compare two codes over the course of an interview, so we can see which codes are used more frequently than others. For instance, we can see that these yellow codes here are really only mentioned once and then never again. I can also see these red codes. These are all different dimensions of safety and disputes on the bus. And that seems to be a really popular topic for Vito. He's really concerned about overcrowding and safety more than he is about any other aspect of the bus here. You can also use code lines for focus groups to compare which speakers are reacting to each other. So when you have focus group data in MAXQDA, you'll actually have your speakers in your code system. And so you'll be able to see speaker A is talking in paragraphs 1 through 3, 10 to 11, etc. Speaker B is in 1 through 3, responding to speaker A, and so on. There's some other options that you can do here as well. This is an interactive table, as are a lot of the visual tools, actually. And so what we can do is we can double click any of these bars to display the text in the document browser. And this really goes back to the fact that, of course, when we're doing qualitative data, context is really king. And so it's not really enough for me to know that, Vito is talking about overcrowding a lot, and then he's talking about safety. It would really be more beneficial for me to go back to the original text to read the context around that and actually see what he's saying. And so I can easily do that just by double clicking on the bar. And if I minimize this, you'll see that it's now highlighted that segment in the document browser for me. So now I can read what he's saying about the overcrowding. Just to illustrate it, because I know it happened in the background, if I wanted to read about the routes and the accessible neighborhood of the bus, this purple one here, double click it, and the document browser jumps and highlights the segment. You can also change the column width in here, so you can simply, now it's not letting me do it for some reason, but typically you'll be able to drag and drop. Oh wait, here it is. Sorry, this slider at the top here, you can increase the spacing of your paragraphs. You can really spread it out or keep it really compact to see more of your document at the same time. You can also aggregate, as I mentioned, by collapsing your hierarchy. And so in this case, I didn't feel like it made much sense to do it because I would lose all of this meaning. But if you did want to aggregate, you can simply click on the arrow that's next to the top level code. This will close all of the subcodes, and it will just be aggregated to the top level. This is helpful if you have more categories than I do. As I mentioned, this current project here is sort of like halfway through the coding process. And so it's not as organized as it should be or as it would have been at the very end. but it's helpful to aggregate depending on how you've coded. And lastly, with a lot of the visual tools that we'll see today, we can also either copy this to our clipboard, or we can export it. So you'll see in the very top right corner, there's this camera icon. This will copy it so we can paste it somewhere, or we can export it again using the little arrow button. And this will save it as a file to our computer. Another thing that I want to briefly bring your attention to is this little blue eye icon in the top right. You'll see this in almost every window in MAXQDA, and this is the Help button. If I click on this, it will bring me to that online manual that we talked about at the beginning, and it will bring me directly to the page that talks about this particular tool. So if you're ever stuck on any window or any tool in MAXQDA, look for this blue eye. It will either be in the top right or the bottom left sometimes, and it'll bring you directly to the help page so you can read about the function. Next, we have the document portrait. And this also works with just one document, and it's going to give us a visualization of the document or of the transcript as if it were printed out on one piece of paper. This document portrait does rely on color to be able to be interpreted. So you will want to have different colors for your codes depending on their meaning. Because if you have everything in blue, as I do down here, it will be completely nonsense for you. And I'll actually give a demonstration of what I mean by that. So I'm just going to activate a bunch of stuff here. Okay. When I click on Document Portrait, it's going to ask me if I only want to do it for the activated codes, so these ones here in red. If I hit yes, it will only use those. If I hit no, it will take all of the code system into consideration. So you can decide which one you would like better. Whoops. And as you see here in our document portrait, this is the page, and it's showing me just a big chunk of blue. And that's because all of my codes that I chose are blue. And so, as I said, this is completely just nonsense. So again, in MAXQDA, color is a really important analytical tool. So it really does pay off to be very deliberate about the colors that you choose for your codes. And that's not to say that you need to have the code correct from the very beginning. You can always change your color later depending on how your code system develops, how you organize your codes, etc. So again, don't feel like you need to get it right the first time. You can always change the color. And if you wanted to quickly change the color of a code, you can right-click on it here in your code system and choose a new color here from the color picker. If I choose pink, you can see now that this one is pink. Okay, so now let's look at the document portrait for real. I'm going to, again, activate my different codes here, the experience and the journey. And the document portrait, again, is going to use whichever document you have open here in your document browser. So in this case, it's going to use Vito's interview. So now what we have is, again, if we were to take the whole interview and print it out on a piece of paper, this is what it would look like. Each colored square here is representing a code. And so we can see where our codes are placed in the document. Up front here, we have the blue codes, followed by the darker blue codes. Then we're on our red codes a lot. Those are, again, elements of safety. And then we talk about purple a bit before ending in red in the document. Here, my use of color still isn't perfect, right? Because I have, like, safety is red, but so is theft, and so is coin shortage. Like, there's definitely a lot more work that I can do on this code system to make it a little bit better. But nonetheless, because I do know the general gist of the different colors here, I can interpret this a little bit and at least know that Vito, again, here is very, very interested in talking about the different safety issues on the bus. I can get even more information about what these different dots mean by mousing over any one block. Why won't it do it? Sorry, I had a setting clicked on. So up here in the top toolbar, there's this little like arrow icon, and this will mix colors when codes overlap. So you can see as soon as I clicked it, it pulled out some colors here. So actually we can see that he's talking about purple, and then he's talking about yellow, which are the different actors, then purple, then red again. If you have it in the unmixed option, if you mouse over the blocks, it will tell you which code it's talking about. And you can actually see a preview of the quote attached to it. So here I'm seeing that he's talking about the cost of the trip, the cost of taking that particular length of the bus, and I can see a preview of the first part of the sentence. It's also giving me some stats here, so I can see that there are 7 coded segments with this color, and I can also see the number of tiles here in the document portrait. There's also other options up here as well. So this very first one in the top left will add in any blank spaces that you have in the document. So now it's showing me where no codes have been applied, or at least not the codes that I've activated here. I see the bottom third of the interview has a lot of white space, and I think I probably did code the last third of this interview, but I just simply haven't activated those codes here, so they're being omitted from the portrait. There's also this one here that we saw briefly. It will overlap your colors, so the colors will change based on which codes are overlapping with each other. You can also use this circular icon to create the portrait out of circles rather than squares. There's these options here. They're the little pages. There's one that's just a blank page, and then there's one that has some colors on it. This first one is ordered by document, and so it arranges the colors based on where they fall within the transcript. If I click on this second one, however, ordered by color, it will just group the colors together regardless of where they fall. So this blue one here, this could be anywhere. It could be at the end of the document, it could be at the beginning. It's not taking that into account. It's just grouping according to color. And lastly, you can order it according to color frequency. So this creates a little grouping where we can see visually the frequency of the codes, right? So we have lots and lots of red followed by purple, and comparatively our blue and our yellow are much less frequently used. You can also change the dimensions of the page using this option here. It will just change the size of the portrait. Once again, in the top right, you have your copy to clipboard and your export options. This one's also interactive in the same way that the Codeline was, where if we were to double click on any of these icons, it will bring us to it back in the document browser. So if I wanted to see what this purple code here is, I can double click on it and it highlights it right here behind. Next is the document comparison chart. And this is actually quite similar to the Codeline, but instead of looking at just one interview, it's going to look at multiple documents or multiple interviews. Again, this works on activation, so you can decide which ones you would like to compare and which codes within that you would like to compare. We'll do just a couple here. We'll do 4. I'm using the same codes that I had activated before, and I'm going to come into the document comparison. Once again, it's asking me if I want to do activated documents and codes only. If you hit yes, as I said, it'll do only those you have activated. If you hit no, it will take into consideration all of your documents and all of your codes. Now what we have here is, again, we have paragraphs going across the top. Actually, I'm sorry, they're not paragraphs. Essentially, it's broken the transcripts up into similarly sized chunks. So regardless of actually how long the interview is, it's tried to now standardize it. So it's cut them all into, as you see, 74 chunks here of equal size. And we can see where the different codes are falling within each of our interviews. So this is another tool where the color really matters here. If this was all red, it would tell us nothing. But because I was somewhat intentional about the colors, I can tell where my 4 interviewees, or 5 interviewees rather, are talking about things like safety versus I think green is financial aspects, yellow talking about the different actors on the bus, etc. This is the most useful for structured documents. So if you have something like a questionnaire where all the questions are the same and there's open-ended responses, or if you've done more of a structured interview, this will be a bit more useful for you. My interviews are semi-structured, so they were more conversational. I'm not always asking exactly the same questions at exactly the same time. And so, I think this still has some value, but definitely not as much value that it would have if, section 4 was question A, response, then question B, response, and so on. Once again, here you can double click on any of the bars to view that segment in the document browser behind this window. And the size of the bar is proportional here to how frequently it was assigned to the paragraph, not how extensive that paragraph is. So what I mean by that is here in Adama's row, we have a very large red bar from paragraph 4 to 5. It's larger than this one here for veto. And it's larger because these red codes were applied more frequently than the red codes here in veto. So here we might have that this was applied 4 times, and here in veto it might be 3 or 2 times. It's not taking into consideration the length of those segments, so veto could have been talking for 10 minutes about this red code versus like 1 sentence from Adama. It doesn't matter how long, it's just the number of times that that code was applied to the document. Next up, we have our document map and our code map. These will create a spatial visualization of similarity, either between documents or between codes. So we'll look at the document map first. When we click on it, it's just going to open up this big empty space, regardless of what we already have activated. To start working this, we have to select the documents and select the codes up here in the top left corner. So when we click on that, select documents, it's going to give us a list of our document system. And again, we can choose to include the activated documents, so these ones that are in red, or we can manually decide here which ones to include regardless of whether or not they're activated. We'll do everything today. I'll hit OK. Next, we have to select our codes as well. And this is the same thing. We can choose to either do it with just the activated codes or manually decide from the list which ones we would like to look at. We'll do activated codes. And hit OK. And now what it's done is it's done a similarity analysis of all of our documents based on the codes that we chose. What it's doing is showing the documents on the map, on this grid, in clusters. And the clusters are displayed by color. So you'll see we have a cluster here, sort of on the middle left of the screen, that's in light blue. And then we have another cluster here, sort of in like the bottom right-ish, that's a dark blue. These are our two clusters, and the closer together the documents on this grid, the more similar they are, and conversely, the farther apart the documents are, the less similar they are. The way that it's calculating the similarity is either by frequency of codes or the occurrence of codes. So the difference is here we have the occurrence of codes checked off up here in the top toolbar. And that's just looking to see whether those codes that we selected occur in the document, yes or no. So it doesn't matter how many times those codes appeared. It's just saying, oh wow, code A appeared in Ibrahima and in Ado. Therefore, these documents are similar. Versus frequency, this option here at the top, you can see it's already changed quite a bit as soon as I clicked on that. It's looking at the number of times those codes were applied. So it's looking at code A was, 10 times in Modu, but it was 2 times in CSE. And so these two documents are very dissimilar from each other, so they are far apart. Versus maybe Modu had 10 times code A and Bus had 9 times code A. You can also take into consideration variables in this, and you can select your variables using this option here, select variables. And if you have variables in your project, you can pull them over into this box here. So some variables you might want to take into consideration are, gender, location, age, perhaps years of experience, anything like that as relevant to your research. You can pull it over into this box here, and it will take that variable into consideration when it does the similarity analysis. So if you wanted to compare your documents based on the gender of the respondent, you could pull it in here and it will calculate that as part of it. Depending on what type of variable you're working with, you'll want to have either frequency or occurrence. So if you're working with a variable that's an integer or a decimal like age, where it's a number, you would do frequency. But if you have a text, a date, or a Boolean variable, something like state or gender, something like that, you would do occurrence. This grid is also interactive, as you might have noticed when you mouse over any of the little dots here. it will tell you the number of codes in the document that were taken into consideration. Once again, you can also double click on these, and in the background, it will bring you to that interview in your document browser. You can also decide to remove something from the map by right-clicking on it and selecting Remove. You might want to do this if you just simply disagree with the map because it's qualitative data, and maybe you know that Ibrahima has nothing to do with auto. You can always remove it here. You can also activate the documents in this cluster. And as a reminder, a cluster, you can tell, is the different color. So we have all of these documents in one cluster and only Adama in a second cluster. If you were to activate these documents and we come back to our main interface here, you can see that it's activated everything in the document system except for Adama. And then you can do a different type of analysis using those documents in the cluster. You can also, by right-clicking, save the documents in the cluster as a document set. So if I do this, and I come back to my document system, you'll see I now have cluster set 1, and it's included all of those interviews that belong to that cluster. The set essentially here acts as a quick link. So if in the future I wanted to do any kind of analysis, whether it's a visual tool or mixed methods or what have you, using this cluster, instead of trying to remember who was in the cluster, I can simply come to my cluster set 1 and activate them all at once. The document map, well, one second. So a common issue that I see in MAXQDA a lot is when you're using like a visual tool or something, you minimize it, and then you're like, oh my gosh, where did it go? Like I can't find that screen. It's really hard to tell, but you'll see in the very, very bottom left of my screen, you can see like the very top of that window. You can just barely make out the maximize button here. And if I click that, I get back the document map. So if you've minimized your analytical screen here, you can find it in that bottom left corner. That's something I see people struggle with a lot. Don't worry, you didn't lose it. It's just hanging out there in the bottom. So the document map here is especially good for visually comparing cases. And so it can really help you create a typology or do an in-depth exploration of groups. So this is really good, in my opinion, for legal work in particular. So you could actually compare court cases using this document map and create different typologies for further examination. I don't find it particularly useful for my data in this example. It might be because it's a semi-structured interview, or just the way that I've coded across the interviews is relatively similar. But nonetheless, you can use this to, as I said, create a typology based on specific codes or even specific variables. And then by using that option to create your sets, you can use your sets to then go on to do some type of mixed methods analysis, or you can even just use your retrieve segments window to see what your cluster set 1 had to say about a particular theme in your project. I'm going to reset all my activations. Okay. Next up, we have the code map, and this is going to be very similar to the document map, but instead of looking at the frequency or the occurrence of codes within a document, it's going to look at the overlap between codes. And by overlap of codes, I'm talking about something like what we have here in paragraph 25, where we have designated stops overlapping physically with being on time, overlapping with cost of the trip, and overlapping with the green bus. So let's check it out. When we click on code map, it's going to prompt us to drag and drop the codes into this box. So we'll actually take them from our code system and drag them into this middle area. You can also choose to insert activated codes if you have any activated. So we're going to use these codes again here, and we will insert them. Next, you have different options for the analysis. And depending on what you choose, it will change the resulting map. So first we have intersection of codes in a segment, and that's going to look at, as the name suggests, where the codes intersect with each other. So this paragraph 25, these codes are all intersecting, right? They're basically overlapping each other. The second option is proximity of codes, and then you can set a maximum distance. So if I were to choose proximity of codes, this purple option here, designated stops, it's going to consider anything within 5 paragraphs of this. So this is paragraph 25, so it's going to consider all of the codes here in 27, all of the codes here in 29, and we don't have any codes in 30 because that's me, the moderator, but it will consider up to 5 paragraphs away. Lastly, the option occurrence is again that do these 2 codes occur in the same document, yes or no? So it's going to look at the dilapidated vehicle code here. That code is occurring with mobility, so that's a hit. These 2 codes could appear together in this transcript 100 times, but it's only going to count it once. It's a yes or no question. I like intersection of codes because I have a lot of intersecting codes, just the way that I've coded here, but you can decide which one works best for you. And hit OK. It's going to tell you whether codes have no relations at all, and it will ignore those ones from the analysis. So comfort and overpopulation have no intersections together. I'm not surprised, and we'll hit OK. And again, here we have that familiar looking map that we just saw, but our dots here are the codes. The larger the circle here, the more times that code has been used. And the closer the 2 codes, the more they overlap with each other. So the more similar the codes are, the closer they are on the map. You can change the way that the map is calculated, so you can change that intersection, proximity, or occurrence up here in the top left corner. Right now we're looking at the intersection, but this middle option is proximity.
Excuse me, can you repeat how you got to that point?
Yeah, sure. So we'll back out here. So on our Visual Tools tab, we have the code map, this option right here. We have this box where we're going to decide which codes we would like to pull into the code map. So you can either, I'll start this from scratch here. I'm going to remove all those. You can either simply drag and drop. So you can come over here in your code system and just physically drag it into this box. Or if you have your codes activated, you can hit Insert Activated Codes, and it will pull all of those in for you automatically. If you make a mistake, if you decide you don't want something in the analysis here, you can highlight it and click Remove Codes, and that will remove it from the code map. Oops. Okay. And then you have the different calculations here. So the intersection, as I mentioned, is overlapping codes. So it'll be something like this red code overlapping with the blue highlight. The proximity will be how close the codes are to each other, so within a certain number of paragraphs. And then occurrence, do these two codes occur in the same document, yes or no? Once you've decided on that, you hit OK, and you'll be here in your code map. You can change the way that it's calculated after the fact using these buttons at the top left. So this middle one here will do your proximity. And again, you can set the maximum distance. And now you can see this is much different. Or you can do the occurrence using this last option, this third one here. And it will show you how frequently the codes occur in the same documents across your data. For semi-structured interviews, I really like the intersection and the proximity. Occurrence of codes is great too if you just want to see whether or not some things are talked about to begin with in your interviews. Once again, the same thing as what we've seen all before. These are interactive, so if you double click on it, pull it back up. If you right click on it, you can remove it from the map and it will no longer be factored in. And there's lots of different visual options up at the top here. So you can create more clusters if you would like. And again, the clusters here are based on the color of the little dots above the codes. So you can decide to add more clusters or fewer clusters. You can also show relations as lines using this little red and green icon here. You can denote the minimum frequency that you want to consider, and you can also set the line width to reflect your frequency. So if you click on that, this looks really crazy, probably because of the way I've coded with so many overlaps. Let me just click on this. Okay, this one's better. So now we can see which codes are actually more related to each other than others. We can see safety is linked to drivers, it's linked to disputes, it's linked to the rules and overcrowding, etc. And then the width or how thick these lines are shows that there's a stronger relationship as well. So we have drivers and apprentices being very, very strongly linked, which just knowing the data, that makes total sense because the apprentice is the one who's following the driver in this situation. In the top right corner, again, you have the copy to clipboard option with the camera. You can also export this, and this middle icon here, this will save this as a max map. And unfortunately, I don't have time today to get into max maps, but if you were to click on this, you'll actually save this within the program, and you can always access this code map later on through max maps.
Excuse me, miss?
Yes?
Would I ask? I'm asking about these relations now in this map. You said that the most similar are the closer, right?
Yes.
Does it predict any relationships between codes or variables?
So in the code map, unfortunately, no, you don't have any consideration of variables. It's purely just taking into consideration the codes and where they are in the document and how many times they're in the documents.
Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm. Something I forgot to mention in the document map, though, that your question kind of just sparked in me is you can In the document map, it will take into consideration those variables, as you mentioned, as long as you've selected variables here. And you can also change the way that it's measuring the distance here. There's a nuance between these two. It's very mathematically complicated, so I don't remember the difference, but you can always change it using this drop down here.
You know, I asked this question because I have heard that something, either the max maps or the code maps, they are predicting the grounded theory. I don't know whether this is right or wrong.
That's a good question. I think you could certainly use these tools on your way to grounded theory for sure. Yeah. I mean, it's basically showing you where the relationships are in your codes and in your data. And so you could certainly use it to get yourself to the grounded theory or whichever theory you're working with in general, and in max maps as well. I know I said we don't really have time to get into max maps, but you can essentially use max maps as like, what do you call it, a mind map. So you can come in here and like add your variables and create links and really like visualize any theory in your data and any relationships in your data through here. And this is the code map that we created a second ago. Hopefully in the future, I'll have a specific workshop on max maps, but it's such an in-depth tool, it just didn't fit into today's session. Are there any differences in visual tools within different versions of MAXQDA? That's a great question. I'm using MAXQDA 2020 today. I think, actually, I'm not sure what the differences are. I think if you're using MAXQDA 2018, which was the previous version, there's very few differences in these options. If you're using something even older, like MAXQDA 2012, I'm sure there's differences. But I think in general, between MAXQDA 2018 and 2020, a lot of the differences are either aesthetic or very, very small nuances, and the overall way that you'll work these tools will be pretty much the same whether you're on 2020 or 2018. Okay, lastly, we have the Code Relations browser and the Code Matrix browser, and these are two of my favorite tools in the whole software. Code Relations browser will essentially show us visually where our codes are co-occurring. So it's similar to the code map where we were looking at either intersection, proximity, or occurrence. But instead of putting those codes on a map, it's going to show us the frequency that they overlap. Your question was between standard, pro, and plus. Yeah, so regardless of whether you're on a standard, a pro, or a plus version of MAXQDA, you have access to all of these visual tools. The difference in the MAXQDA packages is in the basic package, you have everything up until reports. So you have reports, visual tools, mixed methods, analysis, etc. When you have the plus package, you get this MAXDictio tab, which gives you a lot of quantitative text analysis tools like keyword and context, word combinations, etc. And then when you're on the highest package, the stats tab becomes available to you. And through this tab, you can do things like ANOVA analysis, you can do a chi-square, like different statistical analyses can be run using these options here. But regardless of which package you've purchased, you'll have visual tools for sure. One second. I'm going to fix my activations. So at the very beginning, of the webinar, I briefly talked about my codes here in my transcripts. And I mentioned that I basically used my highlight codes as descriptive coding to identify the type of bus that was being discussed. And then on top of those highlight codes, I added thematic codes, stuff like safety and the actors, etc. So what I can do with Code Relations Browser is I can actually use these highlight codes here, and then I can look at where all of the other thematic codes overlap with these highlight codes. So for example, I could say, okay, I'm interested to see, this blue bus here, the car rapide. Are people talking about safety more frequently while on this bus than they are talking about safety on the purple Tata bus, for example? The Code Relations Browser will help me answer that question. So if I open it here, we have some options for our rows and for our columns. You can choose either all codes or all activated codes for both of them. If you did all codes for both, it's just going to show you the overlap between every single code in your code system, which you could certainly do. It's still going to be very valuable information. Or you can say, okay, I want my columns to be the activated codes. So each column will be these highlight codes here that I have activated. And my rows are going to be all codes. So the rows will be all of these other thematic codes that I've created. Next, we have the type of analysis again, so we can decide whether we want to measure the intersection of these codes, the proximity, or the occurrence again. We're going to do the intersection, and we'll hit OK. And now what we have here is a really nice visualization of the frequency of the overlap. So again, here I set my columns to the type of buses, and then the rows are the different thematic codes. And now I can actually go across and compare these buses to one another. I can see that the car rapide, this column here, this square is extremely large. As I mouse over, it's telling me how many coded segments fall into this category. So it's showing me that car rapide and chauffeur or driver, this intersection happens 38 times. So across my documents, I have 38 instances where I've coded something with both car rapide and drivers. Conversely, all the other squares in this row here are very, very small, which means that these driver is much less frequently being used with the other buses. This one here is very, very tiny. There's only 2 instances. Same thing here with the DemDick bus. There's only 3 instances of being coded with drivers. As I continue to scroll down, this continues to tell me really great information. Like again, here we have overcrowding with a large dot next to car rapide, but a smaller dot next to Tata. This is telling me like what are some of the relationships between these codes, and I can go ahead and interpret it. In this case, I'm thinking, okay, car rapide and overcrowding are being mentioned a lot of times together. And so it's possible that my respondents think that overcrowding is a much larger issue on the car rapide bus than it is on the Tata bus. They're just being mentioned together more frequently. Of course, as we've already discussed, context is really key in qualitative research. And so, yeah, I know that they're talking about overcrowding and the car rapide a lot, but I don't know what they're saying about the car rapide and overcrowding. The great news is this is also interactive like the other tools that we saw. So if I double click on this square and I minimize the screen, You can see now the retrieve segments window has opened up in the background, and it's showing me only those segments that are coded with both car-repeat and overcrowding. And you'll see also in the retrieve segments window, it says there's 26 coded segments. And if we look at the overlap here, overcrowding and car-repeat, and we mouse over, you can see there's in fact 26 coded segments. So now I can go through my retrieve segments window and read exactly what they're saying about those two topics together. Lastly, there's the code matrix browser, and this will give us a very similar looking output where we have the frequency of codes represented by the size of the icon, but it's not going to look at any overlap. It's just going to show us the frequency of codes across documents. I'm going to, again, just activate these ones here in my Journey Experience category. And when I click on Code Matrix Browser, it's going to prompt me to decide what I want to set as my columns. The unit of analysis here, again, is the documents. So I want to decide, do I want each column to be each individual interview, which would mean column A is Adama, column B is Otto, C is Bas, etc. Or I could also set it to document groups or document sets, where it would aggregate those interviews to the top level. So for example, I can create a document group in here. We'll just name it, I don't know, men, and we can have one for women as well. Let's see. Oops. I'm just going to pull some interviews into each folder. Oops. So now the difference if I were to select document groups here for the Code Matrix browser is it will consider just these folder groups. And everything from Cisse, Bas, Otto, and Ibrahima will be aggregated to just the level men. And same thing with my women's folder. So it's the difference between having the individual interviews versus having them grouped together. And you can also decide which codes you would like to include as well as the documents. So you have the option to only do the activated documents. In this case, I don't want that. I want everything. And also only for activated codes, yes or no. Once you're decided with that, you hit OK. And now we have each of our columns is an interview. I can drag the size of the column to be able to see the label a little bit better. And then going across our rows, these are the codes. And so we can now see the frequency of each code in the document. So right now I have waiting for bus here, and in Dauda's interview, that happened 4 times. There's different ways of calculating the size of the icon here in the Code Matrix browser, and they're a little bit nuanced. So here in the top toolbar, we have these 3 boxes with the green lines within them. This first option is the pound sign or the hashtag symbol, and this will calculate the symbol size according to everything. So if I click on this, you can see the output is now much different, and it's taking into consideration the frequency of all of these codes across all of the documents. So I can see one of the largest ones here is drivers or chauffeurs in Dauda's interview. This one was, it won't tell me how many times, there we go, 11 times he mentioned drivers. And then if we were to look at this medium-sized one here, overcrowding in Papasan, that's also 11, but this smaller one up here is 6. So it's doing it's looking at the maximum number of coded segments in all of the interviews, and it's basing the size off of that. The middle option up here at the top will calculate the symbol size according to the column. So if we click this, it's only looking at each interview, and it's calculating the most frequently used codes in each document or in each transcript. So now I can have Modu here, and I see he has this large one here, designated stops with 5 hits. It's a fairly large square, but this tells me nothing about what was happening in Pop Asan. This medium-sized square for 5 in Modu, if I come over here in Pop Asan, this is a smaller square, but yet there's 6 coded segments. So this 6 is smaller than Modu's 5 because it's basing the size of this 6 off of only Pop Asan's data. And you can see his largest square is 11. So if you have this column option checked off, it's telling you what the most frequently talked about topics were for each respondent, but you're not really able to compare cases because, again, this frequency for Modu has nothing to do with the frequency for Pop Asan. If you wanted to compare cases across documents, you can select this last option, the equal sign, and this will calculate the symbol size according to the row. So now we can look across and say, okay, so here Pop Asan has 4 codes for waiting for the bus, and this is larger than the ones in Sisay and in Ado. So I can safely say that Pop Asan talked about waiting for the bus more than the other respondents. Also, when there's a lack of a square or a lack of a little node, it simply means that that respondent did not talk about that code. So there's also a lot to be gained from the lack of codes, in my opinion. I can see that, theft really was not a concern for Dauda, but it was for other people. I had a question about how do you pick the columns for the code relations browser? So going back to the code relations browser, when we click on it, these first options at the top, this is where you select your rows, and you decide which codes you want to be in your rows. Do you want all of your codes or just the activated ones? And then similarly for your columns, do you want all of your codes or just the activated ones? We'll do all codes for both. And if I hit OK, you can see now going down on the left-hand side, we have every single code in the code system. And same thing, if we go across, the columns are also all of the codes in the code system. So the code relations browser, it's really helpful if you wanted to just compare a few codes against all of the others. That's where you might want to mix and match these options. So, with the example that I gave, I want to see how the buses are being coded against everything else. And so in this case, I activated only my bus codes. And then I either set the rows or the columns to just the activated codes. And then the opposite would be all codes. So now if I hit OK, you can see now, once again, the columns are just those activated ones that I chose, and the rows are everything in the code system. Okay, so that's all I had today about the visual tools.